All right, hopefully you're enjoying your snow day and remembering that despite having the day off from school, you still had some homework to do and shouldn't have any reason for not having internet today, since the primary reason for school closing was that the roads were icy. So, by way of review, let's just look at a couple of things. When we have two intersecting lines, we discussed a number of angle options. If I identify that I have a right angle here, let's give myself a third line. So if I identify this angle from A, B, C as being a right angle, the combination of A, B, D and D, B, C would add up to be 90 degrees. We would call that a complementary angles. A, B, D, and D, B, C are complementary angles because their totals, whatever the individual totals of each of the angles would be, would add up to 90 degrees. So if we determined that this was 35 degrees, I could find the total of my other angle by setting up an expression in which 35 plus x is equal to 90 degrees. And then we simply solve for x. So we subtract 35 from both sides of the equal sign, and x equals 55 degrees. Next thing we need to remember. Now I have a straight line here on the bottom, and it really wouldn't matter if I had drawn that line straight through. We still have a straight line in which I have two angles. I have an angle 1 and an angle 2. And remember that a straight line adds up to 180 degrees. So the combination of these two angles, angle 1 and angle 2, are going to add up to 180 degrees. When they do, or since they do, we call angle 1 and angle 2 supplementary angles. Two angles whose degrees add up to 180. So if angle 1 is 150 degrees, then we could say that 150 degrees plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180 degrees. Since I'm looking for the measure of angle 2, I'm going to go ahead and substitute an x for that and solve for x. So 150 plus x equals 180. Subtract 150 from both sides of my equation, and x equals 30 degrees. Let's do one more review item. I have an angle 1 and an angle 2. We worked with the definition that identified these two angles, angle 1 and angle 2, as vertical angles. And in our definition of vertical angles, we determined that vertical angles are always congruent to one another, which means they have the same angle measure. So the measure of angle 1, if I tell you that it is, let's go with 84 degrees, then we know that angle 2 is also 84 degrees because vertical angles are always congruent. Their measures will also be, their measures will be congruent. Those were the three pieces that we needed to be able to work on your homework. And I know I gave you a self-guided homework sheet, but figured a video would help just to tie some of these pieces together. And it's always helpful to hear somebody talking about the information prior to you doing it. So your worksheet starts off with a refresher on vertical angles. And so I could give you a real simple problem and call this, just like our previous, 84 degrees, and tell you to solve for x. And since I have vertical angles, I know that vertical angles are congruent, so I would say that 84 equals x. Well, then that must mean this angle over here is also 84 degrees. The same is true when the problem starts to get a little bit more complicated. In other words, it has a longer expression. So the problem that you are given as a sample on your worksheet was 170 degrees is equal to 14x plus 30. And again, since we know that vertical angles are always congruent, these two angles are equal to one another. So I can write an equation in which I set them equal to each other. 170 is equal to 14x plus 30. Now we simply solve for x to find out what the value of x is. So my first step would be to subtract 30 from both sides. And I end up with 140 equals 14x. Now 14 is getting multiplied to x, so the opposite operation would be divide by 14. 14 over 14 is 1, so that will drop down an x. Anything I do to one side of the equation, I've got to do to the other side of the equation. So I'm going to divide that side by 14. 140 divided by 14 is 10. So we now know that the value of x for this angle is 10. Because 10 times 14 is 140, plus 30 is 170. So that would create a solution that justifies my vertical angles being congruent. The same idea takes place when we get down to example 2, in which we are given a supplemental line. And so with a supplemental line, before we look at example 2, let's look at the very simple concept of this. If I call this 150 degrees, solve for x. Remember that since it is supplemental, I can say that 150 plus x has got to equal 180 degrees. So I would subtract 150 from both sides, and x is going to equal 30 degrees. The same process is happening when we add expressions into that problem. So let me show you what that looks like with our example 2. So we have an angle on the left here is 10x minus 8, and the angle on the right is 2x minus 4. And those two angles, we already said, have to add up or are going to add up to equal 180 degrees. So we can solve for x by saying this angle plus this angle equals 180 degrees. So my first angle, 10x minus 8 plus 2x minus 4 equals 180. In this particular problem, I have a plus sign between my two terms in parentheses, so there's not really anything that's going to distribute and affect those values, so they can drop out of the parentheses. 10x minus 8 plus 2x minus 4 equals 180. And now I want to combine like terms and solve for x. 10x plus 2x will give me 12x. Negative 8, negative 4 gives me negative 12. Now I want to add 12 to both sides. So 192 equals 12x. And we divide by 12. And so the value of x is equal to 16. Well, this is very helpful to us because unlike this example on the left where we know the measure of one of the angles, this problem on the right has expressions for both angles. So I don't know yet what the actual angle measure is. But since we know that x, the value of x, is equal to 16, I can now determine the value of the angle by plugging 16 in for x. So if I plug 16 in for x, I get 16 times 10 is 160 minus 8. This angle here is 152 degrees. I can do the same thing over on the right. I can plug 16 in for x, so that would be 32 minus 4. 28 degrees. And then we can check to make sure that I did all of my math correctly very easily. Remember that since this is supplementary, these two angles need to add up to 180 degrees. So does 152 plus 28 equal 180? Well, it does on my calculator, so we must have done all of our math correctly. Hopefully this gives you a good introduction and refresher, and we will certainly go over this in class on Tuesday when we come back from the snow break. But just wanted to keep you moving in the right direction, keep you exposed to some of these, some of this algebra, and give you something to work on while you're at home. Have a good day off.